Welcome to part 2 of the class video for Module 2, the first of 2 modules on John Locke. In the part 1, we looked at some of the major themes of Locke's historical context, just to give you a little flavor or sense of texture of what's going on in Locke's world in late 17th century Britain. In this part 2, we're going to turn now and jump into the text. As we do so, it'll be useful to have a sense of kind of the broad outline of the chapters and the thematic threads that hold the text together. You do have the outline available to you on Canvas. There are 3 major components or sort of phases or stages of Locke's theory, the social contract theory. We are born into a state of nature. At some point we enter into a social contract and live in civil society until it goes badly and we decide that we've had enough and it's time to have a revolution and return to the state of nature. One of the nice things about the second treatise and the way Locke presents his argument is that the chapter orders follow pretty consistently with those 3 stages. So we'll look at chapter 1 here, which is a summary of the first treatise and a kind of introduction to the text. And we'll look here in module 2 at chapters 2 through 7, his description of the state of nature. When we get to Rousseau, we'll see Rousseau is not quite so kind to us, and the chapter orders don't necessarily reflect this kind of sequential pattern of these stages or phases in the thesis, and we'll have to kind of reconstruct the different pieces of the social contract theory because they're not going to come at us precisely in the order that Rousseau gives them to us. But Locke is pretty straightforward, so the major theme now of this first set of readings for Module 2 is to get our arms wrapped around this first phase or stage of his thesis, the state of nature. So let's look at the first chapter of the second treatise. Locke begins, "It having been shown in the foregoing discourse," and then he gives us a series of propositions about this guy named Adam and his children and their claims of dominion over the world. And then he summarizes at the bottom of the left-hand column leading to the top of the right. Now, if these propositions are true and no ruler can claim any authority based on Adam's dominion or paternal jurisdiction, and if we don't want people to think that government is simply run on the basis of force and violence, then we must, at the top of the right-hand column, a couple lines down, then we must of necessity find out another rise of government, another original of political power, and another way of designing and knowing the persons that have it than what Sir Robert Filmer hath taught us. So we need to put together a few clues in this first paragraph. Having been shown in the foregoing discourse. What is the foregoing discourse? Well, this is the second treatise of government, so the foregoing discourse is the first treatise of government. So Locke is here summarizing the arguments that he made in his first treatise as an introduction to the beginning of the second treatise. Now, what was the first treatise about? It was about these arguments that this guy, Sir Robert Filmer, had made regarding Adam and his children. Now, who's Adam? Of course, this is a reference to the biblical Adam, the Adam of Genesis, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So who was Sir Robert Filmer? Sir Robert Filmer was a guy who made a biblical argument for the basis of the right of kings to rule. Filmer's major work, Patriarcha, actually came out in the Civil War period in probably the late 1630s or early 1640s, and it was titled Patriarcha or Patriarchy. Filmer's work, or his argument, represented probably the most commonly understood reason why kings should rule. And he asked a question, or phrased the question in a way that most 17th century English people would have understood. He asked essentially, well, what is the most proper or just or fair form of government for men to live under? Well, we should find the answer to that question, like all important questions, in the Bible. And do we find in the Bible examples of democracy? Does God praise and raise up and bless nations where the people have a right to rule? Well, of course not. What do we see as the model of government in the Old and the New Testament? It is these great patriarchs, these great heads of families, and ultimately heads of tribes. So the kind of bumper sticker for understanding Filmer's argument in Patriarcha is the king is to the people as a father is to his family. And of course there's no voting. The father makes the decisions for the family, but the father is, in the idealized form, motivated and bound by his love and empathy and genuine concern for the members of his family. And that is the ideal type of a monarchical ruler. Now, Locke's counter-argument to that, or refutation of that in the first treatise, is essentially, but that's illogical, right? So if you look at the 4 bullet points about Adam, it amounts to, well, how would we know, since we are all heirs of Adam, how could we know which particular heirs could claim Adam's dominion over the world, even if that's what God had given Adam at the beginning? So Locke's argument is essentially that it's illogical to suppose that we could deduce the kings in the world of the 17th century had somehow been anointed by the descendants of Adam and given their right to rule, which of course is not a bad argument, right, to point out the illogic of it, but doesn't get to the heart of what Filmer was talking about in Patriarchy. It's a kind of model of community values and why one person is best endowed with ultimate authority to make decisions for the community. It's because, at least if it's done well, that person is bound by a sincere internal personal affection for and sense of obligation and caring for the people who are dependent on him. And that's a model that would have been very commonplace among those people who sympathized during the Civil War period with the claims of the Stuarts to rule. That principle, that underlying conceptual principle, not simply the illogic of the argument based on Scripture, but that underlying conceptual principle is the heart of what Locke's trying to do here. And so you see that then in the following paragraph. On the right-hand column, first full paragraph. To this purpose, I think it may not be amiss to set down what I take to be political power, that the power of a magistrate over a subject may be distinguished from that of a father over his children, a master over his servant, a husband over his wife, and a lord over his slave. We'll come back to these sets of categories, these labels, when we get to chapter 7, but notice the division. Magistrate and subject are on one side. The power of a magistrate over a subject may be distinguished from, and then this list of other things. So where is political power? Political power is in the relationship between the magistrate and the subject. And how do we know what political power is? Well, he doesn't really tell us what it is. He tells us how we can tell what it's not. It can be distinguished from these other things, right? So we're going to call these other relationships, father over children, master servant, husband, wife, lord, slave. We're going to call that household authority, or the relationships of the domestic household. And we'll come to that when we get to chapter 7. But the foundational principle for the entire text is what I'm about to tell you about political power is not household or domestic power, and that's the fundamental argument of Sir Robert Filmer, not simply that we should look to Scripture or that Scripture gives us evidence, but it's this way of thinking about political authority. That sets us up finally for this kind of definitional final paragraph. Political power, then, I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws and in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. And we'll see each of those values and each of those subclauses emerge in the subsequent chapters. The foundational conceptual principle here, the first chapter, is what I'm about to tell you, whatever you think it is, don't mix it up with domestic authority or household authority. Locke's alternative model, then, of the origins of political power begins in chapter 2 of The State of Nature. To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. And then he gives us two sort of criteria or traits. He says it's a state of perfect freedom, and in the paragraph following, a state also of equality. So here at the beginning of chapter 2, Locke gives us three foundational concepts: the state of nature, freedom, and equality. And it's worth taking a moment then to try to understand what each one of these are. And the first question we'd ask then is, what kind of state is this? When Locke says that the state of nature is the state all men are naturally in, well, that's not a particularly helpful description, right? Well, duh, right. It's the state of nature. It's the state men are naturally in. Does he mean a sort of state of being, a state of consciousness that we can enter into out of our own choosing? Or does he mean a state like a place? Can I get in my car and go to this place? Or was it a place that existed in the past? And as we'll see as we go along, he actually means both of those things. So there's an ambiguous explanation of what is the state of nature. He gives us a little more detail on these two criteria or traits. He describes freedom as a freedom to order our actions within the bounds of the law of nature without depending upon any other man. And also with equality, he tells us that equality means that all power and jurisdictional is reciprocal. No one has any more than the other, and that we're from the same species and rank, same advantages, same faculties, and so should be equal one amongst the other. So hang on to that word same. So we get a little more detail on what Locke means by freedom and equality. It's not quite clear what he means by the state of nature. So let's take a moment and think a little bit about these three foundational concepts that Locke has presented us with at the beginning of chapter 2. The problem of what kind of state is the state of nature. Is it a kind of state of being or state of consciousness? Or is it a kind of state like Indiana or Michigan? Is it a physical, geographic location, even a historical location that you could go and stand in? That tension in the way Locke uses the term state is known as the temporality dilemma or the time sequencing dilemma. Locke says over and over again that the state of nature is a state that men are naturally born into. Well, if we take Locke literally when he says that men are born into a state of nature, it's not a particularly coherent description. Have you ever been present at a birth, or can you imagine being present at a birth and watching an infant being born? When you see that infant, your first thought is not, well, that thing is perfectly free, or that thing has an equality of power and jurisdiction. It's not emboldened with agency in its natural rights, right? So it can't be literally true when Locke says that men are born into we must come to the age of maturity and reason at some point, right? It also messes with the kind of time sequence that he imagines. First we exist in a state of nature, then there's a social contract, and then we exist under civil society. If we are all constantly, if every person that's born in society is born into perfect freedom, then how could you ever have a period of stable government, right? The government would have to be constantly renewed by the consent of every single person as it was being born, right? So it doesn't really make sense that it could literally be true that we're born into a state of nature, either sort of literally, practically thinking about someone being born, or conceptually in the time sequence of the model. It makes more sense to think of the state of nature as a kind of historical time period in the past. We exist under a current system of laws and government. That government did not always exist. If we go to the moment of historical time right before that government existed, we can imagine a state without government, right? So that's a little more coherent in terms of the time sequence of the model. But if that's true, then what does that have to do with any of us? Natural rights, natural freedoms, all this great stuff he's describing, that was something our colonial forebears got to experience. And once we ratified the Constitution, that's something that we don't have access anymore. So who cares about men being? It's certainly not true that all men, because I'm not, right? So we'll see two places in the text. One here at the end of chapter 2, and then further along when we get to chapter 9, I believe, where Locke will essentially stop his argument and he'll say, listen, I know some of my readers are not really buying this, and they're going to have one of two kinds of objections, and you've already seen that at the end of chapter 2. We'll look at those, and in each of those places, what it essentially boils down to is two different ways of interpreting or employing this concept of state, and Locke is never able to resolve that tension in his text. The tension between freedom and equality, not just in Locke's text, but throughout the social contract theorists, is also foundational to understanding this body of literature. So notice how Locke defines freedom. He says that freedom is a freedom to order your actions, right, within the bounds of the law of nature and without anyone else interfering from you. So Locke is focusing, when Locke thinks about freedom, he's thinking about your ability to choose, your free will or your agency, right, is central to Lockean conceptions of freedom. We often call this a negative freedom or a freedom from. What Locke is promising you is you can choose to do whatever you want and no one else outside will interfere with your choice, but it doesn't mean that you can actually do any particular thing. It simply means you can choose what your body does, and whatever happens, happens. So you're free to walk to the top of a tall building. You are free to put on a red cape and a red mask. You are free to sprint across that roof and leap off the building and spread your arms, right? You can do all those things. That is your natural freedom. You are not free to fly. Or if you fail to fly, it does not mean that you are less than free, right? Not only because you're bound by the law of nature, and a principal law of nature, of course, is gravity, but the freedom that Locke promises you is not a freedom to accomplish. It's not a freedom to go to college. It's not a freedom to get the job you want. It's not a freedom to build the world that you choose to live in, right? It's a freedom from other people interfering with your choices. So we describe this as negative freedom. When we get to Rousseau, we'll see a different conception of freedom. Freedom is the ability to accomplish things that you can't accomplish on your own because you are helpless as an individual. And what freedom does is it empowers you to overcome the obstacles that face you. This is a different version of freedom. It's a uniquely English and American idea about freedom. This is one of our primary legacies of Locke. And notice that it emphasizes differentness. It emphasizes you can't tell me what to do. So if I behave and, if I sort of exercise my freedom and do what I want, if my freedom, if my choices are always consistent with what you expect of me, then I can never be quite sure that I'm free in this way of thinking about freedom. And the way that I can test and know that I'm free is if I do something that you would rather I don't do, and I can see that you're powerless to stop me. And so at the heart of this idea of the negative freedom or the freedom from is the power or the authority to be different than what others expect of you. Differentness is at the heart of freedom. And that's the primary tension with the idea of equality. Notice the way that Locke describes equality. He says that you have an equality of power and jurisdiction, or an equality of rights. And equality emphasizes sameness. You have the same species, the same rank, the same faculties in that passage. But notice what Locke stops short of promising you. He does not say that you're going to live in the same house as your neighbors and drive the same car and your kids get to go to the same college. This conception of equality or equality of rights permits an inequality of condition. But it's that focus on sameness that creates the tension with the inequality of condition, because of course if you own more than me, if you're richer than me, then we certainly are not equal in that way, right? But if we have the same faculties and we're members of the same species and you have no formal political authority over me, then whatever inequality exists between us is a natural form of inequality. And we'll see Locke wrestle with that conceptual tension when we get to the chapter 5 of property. So there is this foundational tension in democratic theory, or in social contract theory, between these two fundamental values, freedom and equality. And you may yourself think about our contemporary political culture and identify one political party as the party that particularly defends our freedom, though they may care less about our equality. And you may identify another political party in our contemporary culture as the party that primarily represents equality, though they may care less about your particular freedom. That tension is conceptually foundational, right? It is difficult to resolve them because the core values or the core traits of each are in tension with each other. The more free we are, the more different we are from each other, the harder it is for us to be equal or the same. The more that we emphasize equality or sameness, it's hard for us to know that we are free. That's a foundational ideological tension in American political culture. It's at the root of social contract thinking. And we'll see that recur. We'll see Rousseau wrestle with exactly this dilemma between freedom and equality, and he'll come up with a very different solution than Locke's going to offer us here. And we'll see this tension between freedom and equality recur all through the revolutionary writings. So if we return to the text, we have reason to be curious or skeptical about these introductory concepts that Locke is giving us in chapter 2. He cannot mean perfect freedom, as he says here, absolute freedom. Freedom cannot mean the freedom to fly, or the freedom to time travel, or the freedom to make 1 + 1 = 3. And so too, he cannot mean perfect equality as in literal sameness, because we're all infinitely different. We're all different heights and body shapes and strength and speed and courage and adaptability and intelligence, and in any number of ways. We are different in our faculties. So he can't mean absolute equality. And perhaps most importantly, if we think about these concepts, it seems really difficult to imagine how we could have both perfect freedom and perfect equality at the same time. If freedom denotes differentness and equality denotes sameness, then they may have an inverse relationship to each other. That is to say, the more freedom we have, we're going to end up with less equality. And the more equality we have, we're going to end up with less freedom. So each of these concepts needs a limiting condition, right? And that takes us to the next foundational concept in Locke's text, coming to page 3, the law of nature. You see at the bottom of the left-hand column, Locke gives us this, in the left-hand column, this passage from the judicious Hooker, who's a renowned theologian of the 17th century on the equality of men by nature. And then he comes here at the bottom of the left-hand column. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And so the operation of the law of nature and the kind of dynamic it creates as a limiting factor on natural rights, such as freedom and equality, forms the body of the remainder of the chapter. Because the law of nature, unusually, requires someone to enforce it. And because we're all equally free here in the state of nature, each man has the capacity to enforce the law of nature. We see in the middle paragraph on the right-hand column, and that all men may be restrained from invading others' rights, and from doing hurt to one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. The execution of the law of nature is in that state put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. Now again, what is the law that's being transgressed? In the previous passage, that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So each one of us in the state of nature, when we observe someone violating that rule, that is, when we observe someone harming another, we are each empowered to enforce the law of nature, that is, to punish that person. Right? Now we're bound, of course, by reason to only do so reasonably, but ultimately our right to enforce the law of nature is based on these two principles that we see on the right-hand column of page 4 in the highlighted passage. From these two distinct rights, the one of punishing the crime for restraint and preventing the like offense, which right of punishing is in everybody, the other of taking reparation, which belongs only to the injured party, comes it to pass that the magistrate, who by being magistrate hath the common right of punishing put into his hands, can often, where the public good demands not the execution of the law, remit the punishment of criminal offenses by his own authority, but yet cannot remit the satisfaction due to any private man for the damage he has received. So there's not literally a magistrate here in the state of nature, but Locke is arguing by analogy. If you look at our current magistrates and this right that they have, it's rooted in this natural right, or these two natural rights, the one called restraint and the other called reparation. So let's take a minute to think about these components of natural law and its enforcement. So let's take a moment to consider the kind of dimensions or aspects of this foundational concept, the law of nature. Locke tells us that the law of nature is the thing that preserves the state of nature as a state of liberty and prevents it from becoming a state of license. Now that word license can be difficult for 21st century readers. Locke is thinking of the root of licentiousness, right? That the state of nature is a state of liberty. It's not a state of licentiousness. Licentiousness is essentially a kind of corrupt obsession with satisfying the appetites of the body. If you read your Plato or your in the Republic, right? That sex, drugs, and rock and roll, to be consumed by vices, right, is a state of licentiousness. So freedom is not licentiousness. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want, that there is an excess of freedom that becomes licentiousness and is no longer liberty. The law of nature is the thing that bounds your freedom and keeps it in the state of liberty and prevents it from becoming licentiousness. Now, when Locke identifies reason as a natural law, this is the place in the text where he articulates one of the most common and fundamental premises of 18th century political thought, of social contract theory broadly, and also the place where, as 21st century readers, we can see that it's a foundational fallacy in the theory. If I ask you to name a law of nature or a natural law, the examples that you are most likely to come up with are gravity, right? Or objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by a contrary force, or objects accelerate at 32 feet per second, or 1 + 1 = 2, or the Pythagorean theorem. You would tend to give me examples that could be demonstrated, either defined objectively, like the Pythagorean theorem, or demonstrated empirically with evidence and data, like objects accelerate at 32 feet per second. We tend to conceptualize natural laws as sort of features of the material world that are independent of our own existence and experience. We cannot impose the existence of natural laws. They exist independently of us, and that's what makes them laws. Well, it's not at all clear that reason is comparable to gravity or the space-time continuum or the laws of terminal velocity, right? Look around your world. Look at how people behave. Can you think of examples of people acting irrationally? Right? I bet you can, particularly when you consider their political behavior, right? So think of a proposition like all men are created equal, or do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Are those truth statements in the same way as objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by a contrary force, or truth statements like 1 + 1 = 2? They're fundamentally different kinds of claims about the reality of the nature of the world, right? Something like all men are created equal is a true statement that depends on our experience and the subjectivity of the view of the speaker. It's an argument that advocates for a point of view. It necessarily relies on subjectivity. So when Locke identifies reason as a law of nature, he is conflating natural law with social law. He would like you to think that men are rational in the same way that men are subject to the law of gravity. But of course that isn't true, and it's going to introduce a sort of endless litany of conceptual problems in the political theory that we'll see not only in Locke, we'll see it again in Rousseau, and in virtually every one of the American texts. And one of the first things that we see even here in chapter 2 is that it raises the question then, what happens when men reach opposite conclusions on any given hypothesis, right? When reason does not lead to a consensus about truth. It may suggest that some men are more rational than others, right? An inequality of faculties, which is going to run contrary to our principle of natural equality. Or it may suggest something that's even more difficult to reconcile with democratic political theory, that two men, both being perfectly rational or reasonable, can reach contrary conclusions about their self-interest. That is to say, that the conflict of self-interest is a rational conflict, that it's consistent with natural law. If reason is like gravity or the space-time continuum or Newton's laws of motion, then seemingly it should not be possible for men to come to contrary conclusions about social propositions or hypotheses. It should not be possible for men to disagree on the proposition all men are created equal in exactly the same way that it is impossible for men to disagree on 1 + 1 = 2. So we want to hang on to this problem of reason, or the problem of man's rationality, here at the module 2, and it's going to continue with us all the way through the end of the course. And you can see that, of course, it doesn't make any sense in the remainder of chapter 2, where he talks about man as nature's executive or the executioner of the law of nature. Why does the law of nature, if the law of nature is reason, why does it need enforcement? Do we need men to go around enforcing the law of gravity? Are we fearful that some men won't obey the law of gravity? Are we fearful that some men won't obey the space-time continuum? We'll be going around time traveling, and so we need an enforcer to make sure men obey? It doesn't make any sense, right? Normally when we think of, or intuitively when we think of natural laws, we think of laws that are enforced through nature enforces those laws. They don't need man's enforcement. That's what makes laws of nature and different than laws of men. So in Locke's description of the state of nature, immediately after the introduction of the law of nature, that he needs to turn to, well, how are we going to enforce this thing, unveils the innate conceptual tensions of the model, right? And we're going to return to this again and again through the remainder of this semester. Now, the root sort of principles or rights that give rise to man's power as a enforcer of the law of nature, reparations and restraint, then have important implications, right? Reparations, you may be familiar with a phrase in our legal system, to be made whole again. And so you have a right, it's under tort law, say you're in a car accident and someone rams your car and damages your car and gives you a stiff neck. Well, you have a legal right to be made whole again. That is, that person is responsible for the repairs of your car until your car was in the condition that it was in before the accident, and they're probably going to have to pay your hospital bills until your neck gets fixed and you are back in the physical shape that you were in before the accident. That's the idea of reparations. So if we're in the state of nature and someone violates your rights, they come and harm you or take your property, then one principle is you have a right to be made whole again. And that's the idea of reparations. But restraint is very different, right? It may be that someone came and took your property from you, and so you want to have a kind of punishment, but me as your neighbor observing that happen, I have a rational self-interest in people not going around taking other people's property. And so every person in the state of nature has an interest in restraint. If any one of us finds out that there's some guy going around taking other people's property, then we all have the capacity to punish that person. So the one right is unique in every individual. That is the right or the power to punish a transgressor of the law of nature, but the other is common to all people in the state of nature who desire to live by the law of reason. Now, this model raises a very obvious problem. That is to say, I get to decide when someone has violated my rights, and I get to punish them. I am the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury all rolled up in one. How can it be fair that I get to determine when someone has violated my rights? Well, it's necessarily the condition of nature because there's no authority over us. But how can you expect me to be rational in judging my own cause? And that takes us then to the final portion of chapter 2, where Locke wants to deal with two objections to his theory, and we'll see in those objections the principles of the temporality dilemma. And if we return to the text in the final pages of chapter 2, then we'll see it's exactly that conceptual problem that Locke is trying to wrestle with at the end of the chapter. On the left-hand column, in the paragraph that starts in the middle, he writes, "To this strange doctrine, that in the state of nature everyone has the executive power of the law of nature, I doubt not, but it will be objected, that it is unreasonable for men to be judges in their own cases. that self-love will make men partial to themselves and their friends, and on the other side, that ill nature, passion, and revenge will carry them too far in punishing others, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow, and that therefore God hath certainly appointed government to restrain the partiality and violence of men. And a second objection then, at the next paragraph, it's often asked as a mighty objection, where are or ever were there any men in such a state of nature? So these two objections that Locke wants to address at the end of this chapter, notice how they correspond to the temporality dilemma, right? Is the state of nature a kind of state of consciousness, a state of being that we can enter into at any particular time by sort of changing our state of mind? Or is the state of nature a physical time, a physical place and location, maybe located in historical time, that we could travel to and actually stand in and enter into in a physical way? These two objections correspond to those two different ways of thinking about what is the state of nature. Now notice that Locke's answers are not particularly satisfying. To the first objection, he says, I easily grant that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which is basically to concede the point, which is basically say, yes, that's true. Men would be partial to themselves and their friends, that their self-love does corrupt their reason, and that's why they need government. What is that except a concession that men are not actually rational? Not a particularly satisfying solution. If we come to the question about historical time and place, Locke does have examples for us. He says all the present rulers in the world are in the state of nature one versus the other, which is to equate every individual with the sovereign of a government. Doesn't quite make sense. And then he gives us some more examples at the conclusion of that paragraph. He says the promises and bargains for truck and such between the two men in the desert island mentioned by Garcilaso de la Vega in his History of Peru, or between a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America, are binding to them, though they are perfectly in a state of nature, in reference to one another. For truth and keeping of faith belongs to men and not as members of society. So he gives us a couple examples here, sovereign rulers of nations, and then two men in a desert island, or a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America. But why is that obligatory to them? Internally to them, men and not as members of society, which is a reference exactly back to the first objection, which he concedes is only solvable by government. So Locke struggles with the dilemma of the temporality of the state of nature, and he's flip-flopping back and forth, and he can't resolve this objection to his theory. And it's exactly this dilemma, this instability in the conceptual framework that he's trying to articulate, that leads us to chapter 3 on the state of war. So Locke tells us that there's a clear distinction between the state of nature and the state of war. That the state of nature is marked by reason and cooperation and people getting along, and that the state of war is marked by unreason, violence, and force. But they have this common characteristic that there is no common superior. So what Locke is doing here is trying to make an exception, carve out a distinction that makes his version of the social contract really unique from either Hobbes or Rousseau, but also creates one of the foundational dilemmas of the Lockean approach to democratic theory. If you remember Hobbes, if you had a chance to read Hobbes's Leviathan in Foundations, hopefully you read the chapters on the state of nature. One of the famous lines from Hobbes's Leviathan is that man's condition in the state of nature is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, Hobbes thinks the state of nature is an awful place and that it's dominated by force and violence. You'll also see when we get to Module 3 Module 4, that Rousseau describes the man in the state of nature as a stupid and unimaginative animal. Now, what Hobbes and Rousseau both mean by the state of nature is man's pre-social state. That is, they both describe the condition of having no common superior with this single term, the state of nature, and they depict that thing, the state of nature, as a dark and dangerous and violent place that man ought to be eager to get out of. Locke would like us to believe that portrait of the state of nature is wrong. Oh, you'd have to be a cynical fool to believe Hobbes when he says that conditions in the state of nature are solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, Locke doesn't know about Rousseau's writing, but he would have the same opinion about Rousseau's chapters on the state of nature. Locke says that's not true. Man is rational. Man is cooperative. Man understands that it's in his own self-interest to help his neighbor in the state of nature. Oh, except when he doesn't. And when he's irrational and violent and uses force to get what he wants. That's not the state of nature. That's this other thing called the state of war. But the state of war is also part of this same phase that Hobbes and Rousseau would have called the state of nature, man's pre-social state, the state in which there's no government, there's no legal system to force us to obey the law. So Locke is performing a kind of rhetorical trick. It's a kind of literary or philosophical sleight of hand. He wants us to disagree with Hobbes, but he inevitably comes back to affirm the same possibilities that Hobbes identifies. Yes, man is violent and irrational. We're just not going to call that the state of nature. We're going to call that the state of war. This is a fundamental duality in Locke's approach to the social contract, and it's going to create endless contradictions and tensions within his theory as we work through the remainder of the text. But what it expresses sort of succinctly is this foundational problem in social contract theory we call the dilemma of human nature, and you could think about it in the following way. If Locke was right, if our true human nature is to be reasonable and cooperative with each other, there would be no need to leave this state of nature. We would never need government and laws. That we cannot survive in the state of nature seems to prove that we are fundamentally irrational and violent, that we can't get along with each other. But if that is our true nature, then why in the world would you ask us to give consent to the laws? And indeed, both Hobbes and Rousseau are going to say, in essence, well, man can't get along in nature. He's irrational. There's no way we should ask him to vote and give consent to the laws. That would merely replicate the problems that man creates in nature. We have to have a government that overcomes man's natural freedoms. Natural freedoms are a bad thing. They're an antisocial force. The Lockean approach to this problem is essentially hypocritical. He says, oh, we are rational and cooperative, therefore we should give our consent to the laws. But the whole reason we have to create laws is because some people, at least, were irrational and violent. That's a foundational dilemma for the Lockean approach that doesn't really bother the Hobbesian or the Rousseauian approach, as we'll see when we get to Rousseau's On Social Contract. Now this dilemma, the dilemma of human nature, then raises this problem of how can I tell whether I myself am being irrational or rational, or how can I fairly judge others? I'm responsible for enforcing the law of nature. Who gets to determine, since my own reason is corrupted by my self-love? Who shall judge is the final problem that Locke confronts in chapter. And so if we return to the text in the final page of chapter 3, we see in the last paragraph that this is the fundamental problem that Locke is trying to resolve. He writes at the bottom of the right-hand column, to avoid this state of war, wherein there is no appeal but to heaven, and wherein every the least difference is apt to end when there's no authority to decide between the contenders is one great reason of men's putting themselves into society and quitting the state of nature. That is, there is no resolution to this problem. That's why we have to leave the state of nature. But notice these final lines of the paragraph. Where there is no judge on earth, the appeal lies to God in heaven. That question then cannot mean who shall judge whether another hath put himself in a state of war with me, and whether I may, as Jephthah did, appeal to heaven in it. Of that I myself can only be judge in my own conscience, as I will answer it at the great day to the supreme judge of all men. If I'm in a state of nature where there is no authority over me except for God, then I am the final arbiter of whether another person has violated the law of nature, has violated my rights, right? Because I'm the one that has to be accountable to God when I die. So this, of course, that's not a great answer, right? As we've already seen, if I'm the judge, my judgment is going to be clouded by my self-love. But because there's no other authority, I have to rely on my own judgment. This conceptual problem, hang on to this who shall judge question, the final paragraphs of the entire book, when we get all the way to the end of chapter 19, Locke is going to end the second treatise wrestling with exactly this problem, who shall be judge? In that context, whether the king has violated the rules of the Constitution or the social contract, here each individual in nature judging whether another man has violated his rights. Each person gets to judge for themselves, but that's a unsatisfying answer because we are going to ultimately make terrible answers that'll drive us into the state of war. So hang on to this conceptual tension. It's exactly the conditions of the state of nature. It's exactly your freedom and exactly your equality and you relying on your own reason, which drives us all into a state of war and necessitates the creation of government. Those two periods or phases, nature and war, exist in dialectical tension with each other. One is not triumphant over the other, but they get resolved through the creation of the social contract.